No, there we go. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
And excuse me for the North American reference, but welcome to the second half of the Canadian doubleheader. For those of you who were in the room before, Diana just gave a great presentation. She's from the central eastern part of Canada in Ottawa, and I'm from the western part in Calgary, near the Rocky Mountains. And I'm grateful to be here among a room full of Mac admins and developers, because that's what this conference is all about. All of us are inventors. We invent solutions to problems. We figure out how we can automate stuff. We look at a problem and take it, and sometimes we write code for it, right? I love thinking of us as inventors. We're also generally self-sufficient. If you've been doing this as long as I have, which goes back into the 90s, you'll remember the dark days of Apple where if you weren't using Windows, you were shunned, and you really didn't have any support coming from anywhere else. You were having to be on your own, and those of us who survived through those times are really quite self-sufficient, and that kind of ethos has continued. We're also a community that has diverse needs. Some of you will have relatively simple things. I support at a university students in art, music, drama, and dance. We have a really odd payload compared to some of you. But some of you, I was talking to a close to namesake over lunch, Anthony Reimer, and he was saying that, he says, oh, I deploy Vectorworks. Oh, so do I. Cinema 4D, yeah, I deploy that too. But there's other things that we had in common, but there were things that were completely different. And one of the things I really love about being a Mac admin is that we've formed community. We share with each other at conferences like this, in online discussion forums, mostly right now Slack, blogging platforms people go to share what they've learned, and, as I was saying, especially in the dev part, in public repositories, GitHub being the most common. But because we have a room full of inventors, we also invent terms. Sometimes it's one term that different people use to describe different things. Sometimes it's the same thing, but people use different terms. When I came here, I've been here for a few days now, and you notice that even in just like the English-speaking world. I walked by a place where you would place your vehicle for an extended period of time. It said car park. Well, if I was in the United States, they'd call that a parking garage. And in Canada, we have the lovely term parkade. I kind of like that term, but there's different. Go to a restaurant. Do you want to eat here, or do you want it for takeaway? Well, at home we'd call that takeout, or even pickup. Those type of things. Even the bus is on. I would call it a detour. It's on diversion. So we get a lot of that in our Mac admin community as well. I want you to take a look at this term, because this is kind of being the whole point of this whole talk. I want you to think for a minute how you define this term. Now I'm going to give you a multiple choice survey. In a moment, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How do you define thin imaging? You may pick more than one answer. Okay, so got it? For those of you who are visual learners, if you're taking a Mac from an unknown state to a known bootable state to desired state, the only difference between 1 and 2 is use an image in the first one, or in the second, in number 2, you're just installing the OS directly. In 3, there is no image. Okay? So given those, hands up, who believes, for them, the definition of thin imaging is number 1. Okay, so I'd say about a third, maybe a little less, maybe a quarter. How many would say it's number 2? Okay, just less than that. And how many would say it's number 3? How many of you, just curious, how many of you voted more than one time because you believe more than one? Okay, you notice, well, and I would say a bunch of you didn't vote. Maybe you've never heard of thin imaging. If so, that will work in your favor moving forward, but So to answer, what is the answer? I consulted these 6 sources, at least two of which are in the room right now. 3 of them are the most contemporary ones that people have put out there and documented. And a hint, that JAMP APFS paper, that's where I actually got the basis of the wording for the 3 options I gave you. And those were highly influenced by the second article on that list from Rich Troughton. And then I took 3 older sources, including one that I wrote. And one of the reasons I'm doing this talk is anyone who can write 3,500 words on terminology probably wants to give a talk like this. So here's the answers. For each of those 3 I gave, those are what those different sources call those things. You'll notice that the bold one is thin imaging, or the closest to thin imaging that those sources or persons defined. You'll also notice the last one, and the oldest one, arguably says everything is thin imaging of those 3, all 3. You can see how this would be a problem. So if we as a community are going to support people transitioning, as they're going to need to do in very short order, from image-dependent deployment workflows to more installation-based workflows, we need to either use other terms or try to drill down when someone uses a term like thin imaging that might be ambiguous, right? In 2013, I was suggesting, in fact, you see I've got a completely different terms there. I was trying to convince people to use new terms. I'm pretty much done with that. I just want us to understand each other. You know, whether it's a toilet, a water closet, or a washroom, they're all the same thing. We just need to understand that those are the same thing, right? So I'm going to focus my talk on these 5 words. You'll see them come up. I'll even use the dictionary. But this is what we want to know what people have and haven't or have meant on these words, and what we should be doing looking forward. So first word, and of course because I'm in the Queen's domain, we'll use the Oxford Dictionary of English, the British version, for all these definitions. So this is the first for monolithic, and for me, this was always meant I'm delivering all the payload I can in the first in that first block. I'm doing almost nothing after I lay down an image. And I think it's useful because of this to look through a quick history in the last almost 20 years of deployment. Just need to change something here. Great. Okay, so if you've been around as long as I have, you remember that Apple actually had a version of Apple Software Restore for Mac OS, the classic Mac OS 9. In fact, that's the way I started getting into doing something other than files and a little bit of Apple script, and following a bunch of steps to clean up my workflow. For most of us, Mac OS 10 10.2 was the first usable, deployable version of Mac OS 10 that we could use. And along that time, Mike Bombich came up with Carbon Copy Cloner and Net Restore. Carbon Copy Cloner did some nice things, taking out automatically the files that would be problematic to us if we were just taking the cloned from a golden Mac and moving it to another thing. And that served us for quite a long while. And then came Instant Image, where the idea became you could create an image without cloning. You could just install everything using packages to a disk image and deploy it that way. Realize here, we're still thinking in that same mindset that everything is going on the image, right? I know I learned about this first when you will have seen Joel Rennick this morning. Just prior to his time at Apple, and he and his now compatriot in business, Josh Weisenbaker, gave a talk at Macworld in 2008. And this was the thing that really emphasized to me that this was a sea change. It's like everything's about packages. Even at that time, repackaging. So we're getting a little concept here of, well, what does modular come from? Well, so let's define module. Basically, we're talking about stuff that can be plugged in or out, right? Because that was what sold me on it. They're saying, oh, well, you've got this build of packages. Oh, you need to change the OS. Just pull out a disk image from the old one, put in a new one, you're good. Made one transition I did over a Christmas break fantastic. I couldn't have done it any other way. Then along in about 2010 came Monkey, the first inkling of a different way to deploy stuff. And so around the middle of 2010, I call that the end of the monolithic era. Because if this is a history talk, I'm going to give everything eras, right? And understand those of you who do history. These are all vague borders, right? I've just arbitrarily picked this. But this is the era where monolithic, whether you built it modularly or you cloned, was king. And so in a workflow like this, this is similar to the diagram I gave you earlier, but showing you the weight of where the load is. Everyone was calling this imaging, or most people are calling this imaging, simply because all the work was being done in the disk image. And in fact, that's one of the sources of our confusion these days. Shortly after that, the earliest documented use of thin imaging that I got was, that Rich Troughton pointed me to, was a presentation at Macworld 2011. And Rusty Myers was good enough to give me slides for this. If you look especially on the slides on the right, we're talking about whether it's out-of-box Mac, or you notice they say use instant image. That's saying use an image that just has the OS on it or very little on it. All of those they're referring to as thin imaging. That's why in that quiz I gave you, I had all three for this particular original one. I actually confirmed with Rusty too that at that time they were using the word deployment differently. Imaging was really what we think of as, he said to me, deploying an OS and software through multiple techniques. So the fact at the time, we're still talking about imaging, not deployment yet. For me, the real change in C, or the idea that we had actually started to, or the inventors had started to fragment terminology, was a discussion in October 2012 on the Mac Enterprise list that's run out of Penn State. Best summed up by these two posts, two people who are here at the conference. Ben talked about something that is very, very similar. It's saying imaging, and we're still essentially defining it as imaging, not deployment, but that it's monolithic, everything's there, modular, thin, minimal image, I'll call it a minimal image, and then apps added later, probably on first boot, and thin being no image at all. Greg Nagel, however, and this is probably because of where he's coming from on the dev side, thinks of thin as the lightweight image, but it's just a lightweight variant of modular. And he called the one without image no imaging. He now, as you might hear tomorrow, he's now calling this an installation-based workflow, which I think is a little clearer now. And then we started calling it. It became clear that we were now talking about two different things, and then the move started towards the word deployment. I know that was the sales pitch I made in my 3,500 word manifesto in 2013. I thank you for anyone who took the time to read the whole thing. I know it was a slog reading through that, but it did lay out a bunch of things. And one of them was the definition of system deployment. Now that one I actually got, the system deployment I got through Wikipedia, but that really aligns with what I'm thinking about when we think about deployment. And I think that is kind of the current version. So when I talked about that in post in AFP 548, I called imaging just the part with the image. Now later that year in 2013, Duncan McCracken, I guess word had got all the way down to Australia. He came up to Mac sysadmin, and he put imaging in these 4 categories, different than what we saw where Ben Toms had done it. He defined monolithic as simply being dead, modular being monolithic imaging but with a modular approach. You collect packages and put them in the image, and thin being create a baseline image, what would be just on a factory system, and finally no imaging the OS that was already there. So you're getting a kind of a pattern. We're kind of building into 2, I don't want to call them camps, but two groups of the terminology that you use interchangeably. Auto damage came along to replace InstantImage, so you'll understand that that is now our modular tool, and it provides even more features than InstantImage ever did. And then in the United States, we got DEP, Deployment Enrollment Program, and that's Apple now picking up the word deployment and using it for this cycle. So now we've pretty much confirmed that we're going to be talking about deployment, and then that lovely tool called Auto Package that came. Of course, in the summer of 2014, some of you may have seen this presentation, and particularly this slide from John Kitzmiller. He wasn't the first to say that imaging is dead, but he was pretty close, and he seems to have been a little bit prescient in that regard. Certainly wise to sound the alarm. Now, we've still been working in that space up until very recently. We've learned how to automate more. We've done things through that. So, of course, I have to name the period up to 2017, middle of 2017 something. So I'm calling it the automation era, because there are plenty of people in our community, they learned how to, our workflows changed. We automate everything. We weren't manually installing stuff onto a computer and cloning it. We love wonderful tools, just tons of tools. Many of them are mentioned already on the slide. And I think because of that, we've now, as of about August 2017 is where I'm putting the line for our current era, which I'm calling the post-imaging era, just for fun. Because there's a triple meaning to that. Using it, according to Apple, as we'll see in a sec, imaging is in the past. Second meaning, our workflows now will generally begin after where we laid down an image. It might change a bit. You might still use one to recycle a machine, but generally all our work is going to be after. And then post-imaging, it's probably going to be confusing to people if we keep using the word imaging. It's probably something we should take out of our lexicon, because it means different things to different people. So I started in August of 2017 because, that's the month that Apple put out this knowledge base article. And when they said that they didn't support monolithic system imaging anymore, in a call-out box like this is Apple all caps, boldface. They just wouldn't have they have too much style or class to put it in all caps, boldface, right? This is them screaming, I don't want to say imaging is dead, but we're in a post-imaging era. Now, Apple is very deliberate in their use of terms. In fact, they even have a style guide that tells you when to use terms, when not to use terms. I want to focus on these 5 words in that statement that has kind of confirmed where we kind of saw things, and parse it a bit. Once again, I mentioned the Apple Style Guide, so there's a reference. You can get it online. In some countries, you can get it in the iBooks, through iBooks. Not in my country, but I have to use the link. And of course, there's also the macOS deployment reference, which reinforces kind of Apple's definition of deployment and all the things in it. So let's talk about the last 2 words, upgrade and update. This is pretty straightforward for people. They kind of intuitively know that upgrade is major version, update is minor version, or, as we might have seen late yesterday, an update. that would not increment, would not change your OS, but anything. And it applies to Apple's apps as well, like Logic Pro, GarageBand. They use the exact same terminology. So the way I interpret that is, Apple has said it's not supported anymore to lay down an image if the OS on your image is not exactly the same OS that is currently on your machine, right? Parsing Apple's words, you might have thought if you weren't parsing it that it was just going to be, I'm not supposed to go from 10.12 to 10.13. No, they're saying there might have been a firmware update in there somewhere, because that's the main reason they're doing it. It really has to be the same, literally the same point release. So the other three words, monolithic system imaging. Apple doesn't have definitions for that in their style guide. But I think you'll understand from the little conversation we've had so far, people mean different things through the different words. So why did they say monolithic system imaging? I think I figured it out, why they use those terms. Remember, here are the terms from earlier. And I said there were kind of two groups of people in general that use the terminology. Monolithic, modular, thin, and no fourth term. And that would be, people like Rich Troughton, the list that Ben Toms gave. The issue is, the first one uses an image. The second one, in most cases, uses an image. Jamf's wording is a little imprecise. But the second one uses an image. Third one does not use an image at all. So Apple's saying, so if you're talking to this group, if you say monolithic, that gets rid of most of the cases that those groups would be. And the other people in that group would be smart enough when this says system imaging to figure out, maybe that, if I call modular one with an image, then that's gone too. But for the other group, the ones that say if there's no image, the moment they saw the word imaging, it meant it was all off, right? So whereas I could have seen Apple just said imaging or system imaging, I think adding the monolithic doesn't mean that only big fat images are no good. In fact, I confirmed it with an Apple SE. It's any block copy of the system, right? So that's one of the things that we're going to have to share with our colleagues that maybe aren't here or are saying, it's not that bad. We can do other things. I think moving forward, the better way to start talking about things is based on workflow. And realize that there are all sorts of workflows. And in order to help people, and in fact, I had a discussion over lunch about this too. I actually got a chance to practice this. When someone just says to you, I image, you need more information. Even if they say I thin image, you need more information if you're going to try to help them. And I think as a community, that's what we're going to need the next little while. We're going to need to gather and help each other. So, first of all, we have many types of workflows. We generally will have one to deploy a Mac, especially if you're in education like me, you'll have to redeploy, or even if in business, that employee's left, we need to clean it and give it to the next person. And even at the end of the life cycle, you'll all have workflows for that. Whether you can articulate that or not, you all have workflows for that. Then as well, understand that these are all the workflows that we get. That we might have a variation, or we might have a completely different workflow depending on which one of these paths we're taking. And understand, Apple thinks most about the first one, right? So even in the automation era, when we were automating stuff, the best practices were automate as if we're as close to the first one as possible. It's just automatic. No one has to do the manual labor, right? I think that's still the mindset, but understand it's still a workflow if you sit down like a new user with their own Mac and manually install stuff. Still a workflow. I think the easiest way when someone says, I do imaging, or I do this, or even you said, is your workflow image dependent? And if so, did you build the image modularly or did you just clone a machine? I think you can use the golden master thing. Most people understand that. But if not, the cloning one, I saw lots of head nods. It's a fairly known concept. Or are you using an installation-based workflow? Right? Or is you just installing everything? Maybe it takes more time, but that's what you're doing. I'm sure most of you know most of this, but the idea is we need to actually be conscious about it because we'll skip stuff if we don't. Same thing with how do you collect your software, right? If you're an auto package user, a lot of it's going to be automated. If you're not, how do you collect it? Is it all manual? Do you have to go through a central IT unit to get your software? How do you do it? How do you get updates? These are parts of our workflow that sometimes we don't document. And if we have a good process there, it might make it easier for the person changing to change into a new, more modern one. How much is automated? How much is manual? So, adding to the diagram I kind of showed, this is a general purpose, particularly in the automation era, diagram of how people would set up machines or computers. Sorry, Apple doesn't want you using the word machines. It's either a computer or a device. It's in their style guide. Anyway, when we go through here, are we talking about the blue stuff would be anything we would use an image or do a direct install. The green would be anything you would install on first boot or on initial deployment if you're in a DEP situation. And then the next one is how do you maintain it, everything in the red. But you'll note, I think most of you will say, well, isn't there a redundancy in here? Because I would think many of you in the room would think that your deployment diagram looks a little more like this, right? And in fact, in some workflows, you'll have almost nothing in the blue. Right? The same tools that you use, for example, Monkey, to deploy your software are the same ones you use on the first boot too. Right? During the automation era, that happened a lot. And that, of course, is because it's the most effective. You're not doing stuff over and over. You don't have to have these packages in Deploy Studio and these packages in another repo to push stuff out, for example. Now, we're hoping that, like I said, if APFS, the promises of snapshotting come, we can probably even get rid of stuff on the blue other than just a little push a button. We're hoping, but it still kind of fits into this realm. So, of course, that means you have to ask yourself, do I combine those initial deployment? I'm a musician by trade. Initially, and so which is first time only, which is every other time, right? Or all times, right? You have to figure. We need to deduce that too because there might be efficiencies they could find, or someone's doing a lot of redundant work. So Apple is obviously pushing you towards what are officially known as the Apple deployment programs. Now, I learned something this morning in the data jar session that business terminology is actually going to change too, because there's Apple Business Manager in beta. But that also means that even though a lot of us have been using DEP or occasionally DEP, but if we've been using DEP and VPP terminology, that those terms are probably going to start going away in even Apple's lexicon, right? Because in the education era, they're trying to area, not an era this time, they're trying to get everything into Apple School Manager. So Apple School Manager enrolls devices, requires that you have an MDM, and also deals with any volume purchases through Apple Store that are supported in your country. And so the business one is going to go the same way. So that's where I think we're going to have to be a little careful about terminology. So right now, if we're talking DEP, technically, if you're an Apple School Manager country and you've converted over, there is no DEP. It's there inside of Apple School Manager, but it's not called DEP. And if you get someone who's new, they'll never have called it DEP. So you can't always just shortcut that way now with terminology. This link, and I'll be giving you the slides at the end, but this link is the link to the KBase article that tells you what's available in your country. So for example, in the volume store, I can only get apps in my country. In the UK here, you can get apps and books. Those type of details, and which 34 countries there are that are supported. That's a whole bunch that are not supported, but right now there are quite a few that are supported. And so now I said everything was going into that green area. This is kind of now my more discrete diagram, for you visual learners, of how most of your deployment workflows are going to be. So now the green stuff is first time only. And the red stuff is the first time and every time. And that's how you're going to kind of maintain. So I like using the terminology now. You're going to enroll a computer into your system or into management. If you say enroll into management, that covers the E of DEP and the last M of management, right? So that's a better way to discuss it. You're going to enroll something into management. You're going to initially configure it. Now, MDM has some powers that are quite useful in that regard, but not all vendors use it. I'm going to skip ahead and come back for a sec. This chart, and boy, I envy you if you want to type in that link. It'll be in the notes, trust me. But Pepin Brienne facilitated this little community thing. It's all about which MDM commands are supported by which vendors. And so, for example, I know our institution has decided to be a Jamf customer, and you'll notice along the install application line, and maybe you can't quite see it there, but Jamf's main support for install application is to install their own agent, and their agent does all the other installs. Whereas with some other MDMs, they're using install application to install more than just their agent, right? So I think that was useful for me to understand where the line was between what an MDM can do and what an agent can do. So once the agent's on, then the instructions go and say deploy that, and then you're using the same system. This is the workflow, if you will, including details like you have to go and collect the software. How do you do that? That I think most people's workflows are going to fit into, with the exception of anything where you're redeploying or reprovisioning, and then there might be a little something on the front, or there would be a little something on the front. Does that make sense, so that you can actually go to someone and say, well, how much of this you're doing? Because just curious, how many of you are Jamf customers right now? Okay, so how many of you would enroll into Manage by simply telling someone, go install this quick add package, right? To me, that's enrollment without DEP, or without Apple's server, right? So you may still be using, that's what I mean by manual there, where you tell them to just double click and enroll, right? Okay, now, if you want to learn more about that type of workflow, I can recommend a session for you tomorrow morning at 10:15 in the other room, where Greg Nagel is going to talk about literally installation-based workflows. And I always enjoy Greg's talks, especially if you're going to transition to that model and you don't have experience with that. Totally recommend that you go to that. Other things, just to make sure when you're trying to help someone or trying to assess your own situation, is this an education or a business? For the reasons I expressed before, we're in a transition period in both, and we're in different places. And the thing I didn't mention in the other chart is, how do you make software available? So like Jamf customers would have self-service, Monkey people would have managed software center. Or do you force applications on people? How do you make things available? So how are we doing for time? Well, we got about 7 minutes left. This is one of those where, to me, the best way to, rather than just keep this kind of a dry talk, is do we have you've got the box there, we have a volunteer who has a workflow that they think they're going to want to change, that would like to describe their workflow, and maybe I'll have to ask some questions to nail it. Or maybe they're not. Anyone want to volunteer, especially if you know you're going to make change? I'd like to make, Tom, you have good workflows. Well, okay, well then just feel free to describe
But I
that.
have a new challenge.
Okay.
We have been moving at least one of our customers towards centralized authentication through a third-party identity provider. In this particular case, it's JumpCloud. And we have a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. We understand that Apple is pushing us towards the device enrollment program model, wherein the retail out-of-box experience is desired in your environment. But that's put us in a difficult challenge because in order for JumpCloud to operate, it needs to be installed on the machine, and the machine needs to be assigned to the user in the centralized control API.
Right.
And the situation that we're finding is that we're having to take a project that works. We are currently using Deploy Studio to do a bunch of package installs on a machine that's either never booted or recently been wiped and the OS installed. But there's that middle point where we haven't been able to figure out how to take away the user's involvement in making sure the machine's ready for JumpCloud. And there may not be an answer to this, and I'm certainly more looking towards if anybody else is using this and wants to think about it with me over a pint or a Diet Coke a little bit later in the week, I'm happy to buy. But if you're out there, I'd love to talk with you if you're using JumpCloud with a DEP setup, because right now it doesn't appear to have a solution.
Okay, thanks for that, Tom. And I think that's one of the things that I think we're going to come across, and I think will probably be more in Greg's talk tomorrow, or it would be worth prodding there, is that we're going to have things that, I'll put it this way, we've left the automation era. There are some things that Apple has not kindly allowed us to automate anymore. And I think you've just stated one of them. And I think it has certainly been a point of discussion and friction for some people in our community who have felt that Apple is taking away too much and have been fairly vocal about it. But for me, it's, yes, how much we don't want to reduce the user experience if we can, because enrolling device using Apple's methods, according to Apple, is meant to enhance the experience. But Tom just gave an answer that says, well, in this case, it doesn't actually enhance the experience. It requires then more manual labor. And so how can we fix that? And you're right, I have no answer. But I think that's worth having the discussion. Microphone's over there. Yeah.
Hi. So we're about to move the majority of our labs over from a very kind of classic, what I probably would have called thin imaging workflow. So you put a USB stick into the machine, it boots up, goes away and reboots from a netboot server, pulls an image down. The image then has some first run scripts which sort of bootstrap the management framework and install all the packages, et cetera, et cetera. So it was entirely hands-off, apart from some sort of initial making the thing boot from a netboot server. We're moving that all to 10.13 this year, and it's still not clear to me what Apple expects us to be doing in a kind of lab environment, particularly if we want to be dealing with netboot type or net install type situations. And this is partly because I just haven't read the documentation, and I think we're a little bit late to the party probably in only just now moving our labs from this workflow. But it's another sort of, I'd be very interested to discuss with anyone who has a lot of Mac labs particularly in a kind of academic setting, how you deal with that, whether you can realistically have the device enrollment program across hundreds of different purchasing units who may not all play by the same rules. I think there's a lot of challenges on that one.
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges, but what I'll say from your standpoint is you're talking about doing basically the main installs through your agent. And you didn't say which one it was, but
it has been a homegrown one, and it will be Jamf. So we're moving to Jamf.
Okay, but I mean, yeah. So a homegrown one is fine. To me, it's like your workflow is great. The only thing Apple's going to kind of push you off of is changing that image, laying down that minimal image. And just installing the OS instead, using like Start OS install. And Apple actually supports, from what I've read, booting, let's not say iMac Pro for sure, but if you want to boot from a USB stick, but you don't net boot, you actually boot from the stick using a net install that just puts in a few packages. I know Greg Nagel had a little write-up on that on his blog in, I guess we call it the autumn here, in the fall. And he could, I don't think you're going to have, other than the change to Jamf might be a bigger change than there's your workflow is probably going to be it's not going to be that difficult. It's going to be how do I learn to install the OS rather than. And then for me, in my personal situation, I'll be in the same boat, except I haven't used a management agent yet. Have so few machines. I've got away with some practices that are modular, but not as automated as they should be. For me, the big thing will be, how do I get it to do that first part? And in fact, my goal will be that once I get this set up, I'll never nuke and pave, right? Because I think that's the ideal. Unless a machine is sick, I will just, every year, it's like, okay, do I need to blow user counts away? Sure, but I can keep the whole software load, unless it gets to the point where I'm taking too much off and putting too much on, then I just have it reinstall, erase, install the OS, install everything else. There was a question down here, or a comment.
Long way.
Hi, yeah, I was just thinking about workflows again and difficulties and so on. And I can't talk too much about where we are or what we're doing precisely, but yeah, one of the challenges we've hit that I'm sure other people are going to hit as well is the kind of chicken and egg of, you need to get something onto your network, you need to get a device onto your network, but it's certificate based, you need to bind, etc., etc. So how do you bind if you're not on the network? How do you get on the network if you haven't got an AD certificate, etc.? So that's another thing that's coming up. And I was just talking to Joel about it, and there are possibly ways around it, but it's a lot of engineering so that's one of the things that's going to be a big problem, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I concur, and I think, I hope all of you listen to the Mac Admins podcast. I know Charles Edge said something on there a few episodes back that resonated with me. He said, there's going to be a couple years of transition here that we're going to have to, that it's going to be rough going, and that's one of the reasons why I actually put in this talk. It's because we need to learn how to talk to each other so we understand each other, because we're going to need each other's help more than ever, because this is going to be a rough ride for a while. Yep.
I don't know if I'm allowed to talk because you didn't throw me this cube.
Oh.
Thanks for the.
No.
Yeah.
There we go.
It's
Hey!
official. Thanks for the illuminating talk. Just a comment. I tend to think about these things like a thought experiment about what does Apple want here, and it strikes me that it was in that tech note that they put out that Apple wants to move to a system where, in order to install an operating system, the computer has to phone home and get a firmware upgrade. There's no other way to do it. So therefore, cloning will not work because that does not involve phoning home and getting the appropriate firmware upgrade. And imaging does not work, and net booting does not work because it doesn't. Now, why they want to do that, maybe because of the security chip, or who knows, or more control for Apple, obviously, but that's the name of the game for them. And they don't give a hoot about net boot. This is a term that doesn't even matter to them anymore. It's just that a lot of people are going to be complaining about it.
Technically, they don't use the term net boot anymore. They just use net install. It's been a few versions of the OS. For their style guide purposes, they just use net install. But I know what you're saying. In fact, oh, sorry, I just lost the thought. Oh, yes, to install the OS, forget about firmware, because there's a whole reason why firmware, the way they started installing firmware back in 2015, should have broke imaging a long time ago. We just got lucky in some of those things. But they now require in High Sierra that you have a connection to the internet to install the operating system. Now you can build an installer on a USB stick using Create OS install, I believe it is, at the command line. And you can create that while you're online and then use it offline. But it's definitely not as easy as it should be. Seeing no others, let me just wrap up by saying, I said we started with these 5 words. I hope for the most part we're going to start using, kind of deprecate the first 3 words unless we're just trying to understand what other people are saying, and really talk more in terms of the second one and reframe our verbiage for the last 2. Because we want to continue to invent. There are people who've put forward, what are these issues? Well, we're going to have to invent solutions for them. And so we need to be able to talk about them. Because this is going to be a challenging transition, as I said. And I think what's really encouraging, I'm really thrilled that people were willing to let me talk for 45 minutes and be pedantic about words, because I'm not saying you have to be as pedantic as I am, but I think it's going to help when we have good conversations. I want to give special thanks to these people who I talked to when I was preparing this. Some of it I didn't even get in the presentation, like the odd situation with how Facebook currently deploys, where they cache their monkey stuff on an image because they need to do like 500 at a time, and the network's just not going to handle it. But these people all helped out, giving me some of the historical information, some of their thoughts, and I really appreciated that. I have a blog. The slides are not on there yet, but what I'm going to do, because so that's where you'll find my stuff. But what I'm going to do is, since we're over time now, I'm going to use my lovely iPad to send a PDF through Slack. And so the slides for this, so you didn't have to write down or take pictures of all those links. Slides will be in the I should be proper. The MacAd UK channel in the MacAdmin Slack for you to get those links for the sources I gave you. Great, pleasure to be here. Thanks for being such a good audience.